It all started with a letter sealed in salt, quite literally. When Meredith Holloway pulled open the battered mailbox that June morning, the only thing inside was a thick envelope wrapped in wax paper, crusted in what looked like pale gray grains clinging to the seams. There was no stamp, no return address, just her name, handwritten in faded blue ink. She stood on the porch of her weather-beaten house outside Gunnison, Utah, where the wind always smelled faintly of sage and rust, and held the envelope like it might vanish if she blinked too hard. Maxine, her old German Shepherd mix, sat beside her as always, head tilted like she, too, felt something off in the air. Meredith had just turned 76. Her bones didn't care much for mourning anymore, and her hands shook sometimes, not from fear, but from memories that came uninvited. She hadn't been back to Red Flats in decades. Not since her mother swore they'd never set foot there again. Not since the salt took her grandfather, and almost took her father. Inside the envelope was a letter, typed on brittle onion skin paper, and a map, hand-drawn, worn thin at the folds. But it was the signature at the bottom of the letter that made Meredith sit down without thinking. Franklin Holloway, her grandfather, dead since 1935. She read the letter 3 times. It was dated May 1903, the same month the Red Flats Salt Company collapsed, burying 16 men in the deepest shaft, including Franklin. Or so the company claimed. The letter had never been mailed. Yet here it was, smelling faintly of brine and thyme. If you're reading this, then the salt hasn't won. Not completely. Follow the trail north. Find the first marker, the widow's tree. I buried the truth beneath her roots. She stared out at the horizon, beyond the wire fence and dry scrub. The widow's tree. It wasn't just a name. It was real. She remembered her mother mentioning it once, in a hushed voice, back when Meredith was just a girl, an old juniper that stood alone on the ridge near the abandoned mines, scorched by lightning in the 20s. Where grieving wives used to tie black ribbons on the branches during the strikes and disasters. Her heart thudded slow but heavy. She hadn't thought of that tree in 60 years. Maxine whined softly and nudged her leg. Meredith looked down at the map. The lines were faint, but she knew the terrain. The ridge, the canyon, the old mining road that the state fenced off back in the 70s. And drawn in faded pencil, just below the line marked Widow's Tree, was a strange symbol, a spiral inside a square. That night, she couldn't sleep. The letter lay on her kitchen table, glowing in the yellow light like a wound. She pulled out the old box of photos from the closet, one she hadn't touched since George died, and sifted through them until her fingers found what they didn't know they were looking for. A black and white photo of the tree, taken in 1941. 3 women stood beneath it, dressed in mourning. One of them was her grandmother. Another looked exactly like Meredith, except it wasn't her. At dawn, she packed a canvas rucksack with jerky, a water jug, a flashlight, and the letter. She dug out her grandfather's rusted compass, tucked the photo into her coat pocket, and opened the back door. Maxine didn't hesitate. She climbed into the truck like she'd known all along that they were going. As they drove north along the dry wash road, the red buttes of central Utah rising like bones from the desert floor, Meredith felt something uncoil in her chest. Not fear. Not even longing. Something older. Something heavier. She didn't know what she'd find out there. She didn't even know if the letter was real, or some cruel trick of time. But she knew one thing. The salt hadn't won yet. The widow's tree stood just as Meredith remembered it, a crooked old juniper on the ridge overlooking the dry basin, its limbs blackened by lightning decades ago, its bark peeling like old paper. But what she didn't remember, or perhaps had never seen, was how alone it looked, as if it had been left behind by time itself. The wind picked up as she climbed the last incline. Maxine, just behind her, paused quiet on the gravel. The dog stopped before the tree, ears perked forward, tail stiff, eyes watching the hollow where the roots curled like fingers around a patch of disturbed earth. Meredith stood still for a moment, listening. The canyon below was silent, save for the whisper of the wind through distant sagebrush. No birds. No insects. Just her own breath and the soft ticking of memory. She stepped closer, crouched slowly, and brushed away the layer of dry soil with her hand. It didn't take long. The earth was loose, as if someone had uncovered and then recovered it recently. Beneath the dust was a wooden box, maybe the size of a lunch tin, its surface etched with the same spiral inside square symbol from the map. She pried it open. Inside, wrapped in wax cloth and bound with a rusted button, was a single page from a ledger. Salt-stained, torn along the edges. She opened it carefully. Red Flats Salt Company. Payroll, May 1903. Entries marked in red indicate men who were discharged prior to collapse. 4 names were marked in red. One of them, Franklin Holloway. Next to it, in smaller writing, moved to Site 12, no record beyond. Meredith stared at the page, chilled. She remembered the official story, that Franklin and 15 others had died in the mine collapse on May 18, 1903, one of the worst salt mine disasters in western U.S. history. The Red Flats shaft had collapsed without warning, burying workers alive when a wall gave way. Their bodies were never recovered. The site was sealed, fenced off, and eventually forgotten after the company declared bankruptcy in 1912. But this ledger said Franklin had been discharged before the collapse and moved to Site 12, a place she'd never heard of. It wasn't on the official maps. She scanned the box for more and found a small photograph tucked beneath the ledger page. For men in mining gear, their faces shadowed by brimmed hats. One of them had Franklin's nose, his stance. But something in his expression was off, blank, even fearful. Behind them, scratched into the canyon wall, was a chalk symbol, that same spiral. She traced it with her finger. Maxine let out a low growl. Meredith turned. A coyote stood at the top of the ridge, maybe 30 feet away, thin as bone and still as stone. It stared at her with eyes that looked older than the hills. Then it blinked, once, and turned away, vanishing into the sage. That night, back in the motel on the edge of Salina, she laid out the ledger page, the map, and the photo on the bedspread like puzzle pieces. The spiral symbol wasn't just a miner's marking. It had to be older. Her father once told her stories, when he'd still been drinking, about the Salt Widow, a ghost said to walk the Red Flats Ridge at dusk, looking for her husband among the dead. He said the miners started seeing strange symbols scratched into stone after the collapse. Most believed it was grief madness. But what if someone was trying to leave a trail? She pulled out her old highway atlas and traced the faint contour lines around the basin. Site 12 wasn't listed. But there was a flat stretch of land, just east of the original shaft, that had no name. A blank. Just a silence on the map. She packed again at dawn, this time with more water, a digging knife, and her grandfather's compass. She was no longer just looking for Franklin. She was looking for the reason he'd never come back. And as she and Maxine drove toward the edge of the map, where roads turned to memory and dust, she felt it again, that quiet pull, like something buried deep in the earth was listening. The road to Site 12 didn't exist anymore, not on paper, not on signs, and not in memory, unless memory lived in shadows and gullies and tire-rutted whispers half swallowed by desert wind. Meredith had to rely on the old topographic lines in her grandfather's journal and the way the sun cast shadows at noon. She drove slowly, her hands steady on the wheel, the tires crunching over stones that hadn't been moved by men in decades. By mid-afternoon, the truck came to a lurching stop in front of what looked like nothing at all. But it wasn't nothing. Just beyond the low ridge of sandstone was a depression in the earth, subtle, unnatural, rectangular in shape. Maxine growled low and refused to go forward, so Meredith took the flashlight and went alone. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, hidden beneath a tangle of collapsed beams and iron hoops long eaten by rust. It smelled of salt and mildew, of trapped air and decades of silence. The earth sagged beneath her boots as she descended 5, maybe 6 feet into the hollow. There was no question. This had been a mine entrance once. Not on any official record. No signs. No warnings. No fences. And no prayers. Inside, she found the first sign. Literally. A metal placard, bolted to stone and faded by time. Site 12. Do not enter without clearance. Red Flats Co. And beneath it, scratched by hand. They lied. Stay away. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. She had spent her entire life believing her grandfather died in a known, tragic collapse, a sealed and documented shaft. But this was something else. This was a place they tried to erase. She turned the flashlight across the walls. Salt veins ran like pale rivers through the stone, but interspersed between them were markings, not geological, but human. She saw tally marks, initials, even dates. May, June, July 1903. After the supposed collapse. And then she found the spiral again, carved into the wall. Deep, deliberate. Beneath it, 2 words. Salt Widow. She sat down, her breath shallow, her back against the cold earth. Maxine barked outside, distant but sharp. Meredith stood up quickly, shoved the journal back in her coat, and climbed out. Maxine stood at attention, facing the ridge. Someone, or something, had been there. Tracks in the sand. Too big for coyote. Too light for man. Gone now. That night, camped by the truck with the fire low and wind brushing dry grass against canvas, Meredith opened the back page of the journal again. She hadn't noticed it before, a small square taped inside the back cover. It was a newspaper clipping. Miner presumed dead found wandering near Fish Lake, September 1935. She unfolded it, hands trembling. A man believed to have perished in the Red Flats collapse of 1903 was found disoriented and silent near the edge of Fish Lake. Locals report he bore scars and did not speak. When asked for his name, he only repeated one word: widow. The man in the photo had hollow eyes, a beard grown wild. But his nose, it matched hers. And Meredith realized something she hadn't let herself think until now. Franklin Holloway might not have died in that mine. But maybe he should have. The road to Fish Lake wound high into the mountains, climbing past ancient aspen groves and narrow switchbacks carved into red clay hillsides. Meredith hadn't been up this way since the Carter administration, and even then, only briefly. The lake sat like a silver coin dropped into a cradle of pines, too still, too perfect, like it didn't belong to this century at all. She pulled into a gravel turnout near an old ranger station. It had been shuttered for years, the boards across the windows sagged like tired eyelets. According to the newspaper clipping, this was where the man they'd called the Miner Ghost had been found, barefoot and silent, sitting by the waterline. Maxine leapt from the truck and headed straight for the edge of the trees, tail low, body tense. Meredith followed, her boots crunching across pine needles and stone. She wasn't sure what she expected, a sign, a marker, maybe a rusted plaque. But the shoreline offered only water, wind, and silence. Until Maxine started to dig. At first it seemed like nothing, a loose patch of soil between two old tree roots. But the dog kept at it, paws frantic, nose in the dirt. Meredith knelt beside her and cleared away the top layer. There it was. A tin tobacco box, rusted nearly shut, buried maybe 2 inches down. Inside, a folded note, yellowed and brittle, and a lock of pale blonde hair tied with black string. The note was scrawled in pencil, uneven, as if written by someone whose hand no longer trusted itself. The words were simple. I tried to forget the salt, but she doesn't forget me. Tell my girl I didn't run. F.H. Meredith sat back on her heels. Her throat felt tight. She looked out at the water, then down at the lock of hair. Blonde, like her grandmother's. Or her own, once, before the silver came. He didn't run. That's what her father always said. That Franklin had walked away from responsibility. That he'd shamed the family and disappeared into the bottle, over the mountains, or madness. But this didn't read like escape. This read like a warning. She spent the night camped by the lake, the box wrapped in a towel beside her sleeping bag. The wind picked up after midnight, and in the rustling aspens, she swore she heard whispers, not words, not voices, just the kind of movement that comes with remembering something long buried. In the morning, she visited the historical center in Loa, a small stone building run by 2 volunteers and 1 cat. She asked for anything they had on Red Flats, or the Fish Lake incident. Most of the records were gone. But the woman behind the desk, white hair in a bun, hands like wormwood, remembered something. They used to say, she said, that Red Flats had a second mine. One without permits. A punishment shaft. They'd send the troublemakers there, the ones who talked too much or wouldn't fall in line with the foreman. It was hush-hush. Site 12, I think it was called. Meredith nodded slowly. They say one man came out of it, the woman continued, but he didn't come back right. Wouldn't speak. Wouldn't eat. Just pointed to the ground and cried. Folks started calling him Salt Widow's son. Said she marked him. The woman smiled apologetically, like someone repeating folklore they no longer believe. But Meredith didn't smile back. She knew better. That night, parked on a high ridge overlooking the lake, Meredith opened the ledger page again. She noticed something she hadn't before, a faint number written in the margin beside Franklin's name, number 41. It wasn't a pay grade. It wasn't a worker ID. She flipped the map over, ran her fingers across the worn surface, and there it was. A grid. Small boxes, numbered by hand. Box 41 was circled, deep in the salt cliffs. Off every road. North of nowhere. She folded the map slowly. That was where she had to go. To the last unmarked site. Where the truth was waiting. Where the salt still whispered. The salt cliffs rose out of the desert like the bleached spines of some great beast long dead. Jagged, pale, and utterly lifeless under the mid-afternoon sun. No signs, no trails, not even birds overhead. Just endless white stone and silence thick enough to press on the chest. It took Meredith 4 hours of slow crawling in low gear to reach the edge of the grid marked 41 on the back of the map. There were no landmarks, no buildings, just cracked earth and wind-carved rock that looked the same in every direction. But Maxine knew. The dog leapt from the truck and ran, not far, but direct, across the basin to a strange rise in the stone, shaped almost like a lid. A perfect oval of white sandstone, smoother than anything around it. Meredith followed, boots crunching over gravel, the sun baking her shoulders. At the center of the formation was a spiral. Not carved, assembled. Dozens of stones, placed by hand, circling inward around a depression barely visible unless you stood right above it. And at the spiral's center, a small copper token, blackened with age. She knelt, heart pounding. The token bore a symbol she'd seen only once before, on the back of a page from her grandfather's ledger, a handprint inside a triangle. Beneath it, the letters, FRC. She stared at them. Fremont Recovery Camp. It struck her like a thunderclap. The Fremont people, a pre-Columbian culture that thrived in central Utah between 300 and 1300 AD, were known for their petroglyphs, granaries, and ceremonial pits. But recent archaeology had uncovered something else. Evidence that a group of early 20th century miners had copied or repurposed Fremont symbology in off-grid locations. It was controversial, mostly ignored, but a 1974 paper from BYU mentioned the acronym FRC found etched into rock near a forbidden shaft west of Capitol Reef. The implication was chilling. Someone had revived the old rituals and used them. Maxine whined. The sun had dipped, and the desert was shifting, colors growing colder, the wind picking up grit. Meredith took out her flashlight and scanned the surrounding ridge. And then she saw them. Shallow alcoves in the cliffside, man-sized. Carved. Not caves, but niches. And inside two of them, bones. Arranged deliberately. Kneeling. And painted on the stone above one of them, in faded ochre, the same spiral and side square symbol. Her grandfather's mark. Meredith stepped back, heart hammering. She wasn't standing at a grave. She was standing at a ritual site. Not Fremont. Not entirely. A hybrid. A perversion. Something built by desperate men who thought the salt had eyes. Men who believed that to escape collapse, something had to be given. Or someone. She sat on a rock as the wind howled and Maxine circled her like a restless sentinel. She reached again into the canvas bag and took out the last thing she'd brought, her grandmother's rosary. She didn't know why, but she placed it at the center of the spiral. Not as a symbol, as a question. And in that moment, beneath the dusk light and the first stars, the wind stopped. Utter silence. Then a sound. A stone rolling. Behind her. She turned fast. Nothing. But when she looked back down at the spiral, the rosary was gone. Maxine barked once, short and sharp. The spiral had closed slightly, as if the ground had drawn it in. The next morning, Meredith didn't go home. She followed a dirt track west, one not on any modern map, but marked faintly in her grandfather's journal as Old Salt Pass. It cut through dry ravines and valleys where the sun never fully reached, and the rocks looked like they'd been watching since time began. Around noon, she saw it, a small shack tucked beneath a cliff face, its tin roof sagging, an old antenna rising like a dead limb into the sky. Someone lived there. Maxine barked once, not in warning, but as if she recognized something. Meredith slowed the truck and stopped 10 yards from the porch. An old man sat in a wooden chair, carving something from bone. He didn't look up. "You took your time," he said. His voice was rough, like wind over broken salt. "You knew him," she said simply. "Frank Holloway." The man replied, still not meeting her eyes. "He was my uncle." Meredith took a breath. "You're from the Holloway line?" "I'm the last one who stayed," he said. "The others left when the mines closed. I stayed because someone had to remember." She approached slowly. "Remember what?" The man looked up finally, and there was nothing senile in his gaze. Only a burden carried too long. That Red Flats didn't collapse because of bad rock. It collapsed because they took something they weren't supposed to. Opened a shaft beneath the old Fremont site. They ignored the signs. The spiral, the handprint. They thought it was superstition. But the salt wasn't just salt down there. It hummed. It listened. She swallowed. "My grandfather, he didn't die there." The man shook his head. "He led the team that broke the seal." And after the first 3 men went mad, they sealed it back up. Or tried to. But something had come out. Not a monster. Not a ghost. Just something that followed them. Stayed in their heads. Made them whisper to the cliffs at night. Made them see things. Meredith sat on the steps, too tired to feel fear. "The Salt Widow?" she asked. He nodded. "She's not a person. Not really. She's grief, hunger, memory. Whatever's buried too long in salt comes out wrong. And your grandfather? He tried to undo what they'd done. Buried the records. Marked the sites. But it was too late. She'd already taken something from him. His mind." Meredith whispered. "No," the man said. "His name. His story. He couldn't carry it anymore. That's why he wandered. That's why he left you only pieces." Meredith pulled the token from her bag. "I found this." The man held out his hand. Took it. Nodded slowly. "That's from the last circle, where they swore the truth into stone." He looked up at her, eyes bright despite the age. "But truth doesn't stay in stone, Meredith. It stays in people. And now it's yours." A long silence passed between them. The wind moved through the cliffs like breath. "What do I do with it?" she asked finally. The man smiled sadly. "You bury it where the salt can't reach." The next morning, Meredith rose with the light. There was no ceremony, no goodbye. The old man had left a note on the step. 6 words penciled in block letters on a page torn from a mining logbook. "You're the last. Make it count." She folded it, pressed it into her coat, and turned toward the basin one final time. She didn't go back to Site 12. She didn't return to the spiral, or the bones, or the shack where secrets had been spoken aloud for the first time in decades. Instead, she climbed high, higher than she'd ever been, beyond the road's end, where the map turned white and the air grew still. The ridge above Fremont Wash was raw, silent, and clean. No salt veins. No whispers. Just stone, wind, and the steady beat of her own heart. There, in the hollow beneath a dry juniper tree, she dug a small grave. Not for bones. For memory. She placed the copper token inside. Then the ledger page. The photo. The lock of hair. And finally, the tobacco tin. And then she added something new. Her grandmother's rosary, returned to her coat pocket the day after the spiral took it. Found lying on the seat of the truck the next morning, clean and dry. She covered the hole with earth. Pressed the stone down. And for the first time since the letter arrived, she exhaled fully. Maxine lay nearby, resting her head on crossed paws, watching. Below, the desert stretched in endless, amber silence. She stayed there a long time. Maybe an hour. Maybe 2. Not waiting. Letting go. Later, she drove to the tiny library in Gunnison and left a sealed envelope addressed to the Town Historical Society. Inside were copies of everything. The maps, the notes, the photograph of the miner by Fish Lake. No explanation. Just a line. For those who still believe the desert forgets. Then she returned home. Cleaned the porch. Fed the dog. Opened the letter from her daughter that had sat on the mantel for 6 weeks. Inside, a photo of her grandson in a scout uniform. Holding a compass. Smiling. And a note. "Mom, when you're ready, come visit. We miss you. I know there's history you haven't told me. I'm ready to hear it now. Ellie." Meredith sat on the porch until evening, Maxine curled against her side, the light turning gold over the ridges. The salt had tried to hold on, but memory had let go. And in that silence, warm, real, and finally hers, she smiled.